So I am really thrilled tonight to bring to introduce you to two people. Chris Edwards began his career as a forecaster in the U.S. Army and was one of the first meteorologists on the Weather Channel. He was a forecaster in Milwaukee and Philadelphia and Detroit. He began reporting on global warming back in 1987 and has even started his own business teaching weather science. He has won 3 Emmy Awards and is a five-time winner of the Best Weathercaster from the Michigan chapter of the National Association of Television Arts and Sciences. He serves as the climate change specialist for the city of Detroit and regularly gives climate change presentations, which you're going to hear tonight. And then after Chris speaks, we're going to hear from Tina Catron. She has been a Michigan organizer for the Environmental Defense Fund Action for over 5 years and has successfully built a network of climate advocates there in Michigan. She and EDF work with legislators across the state of Michigan to support good climate policies and push back on rollbacks to agencies like the EPA. And she works on issues including water quality, air quality, and emissions from the transportation sector, which makes sense in Detroit and in Michigan. Okay, I am now going to bring up Chris and we're going to turn it over to Chris and Tina here. So welcome.
Thank you very much, Julie. I appreciate it, and I am going to get right into it. Yeah, I've been studying and reporting on climate change since 1987, which is a long time. It's a complicated topic, but my job this evening is to make it as simple as it possibly can be. It's going to involve a pretty fair number of slides, so I'll give you a heads up right off the bat that we are going to move along at a pretty brisk clip. Of course, there will be time, as mentioned in the after party, for questions and answers. But I want to get started by giving credit where it's due. Our changing climate, which is part of the title of Climate Change 101 this evening, is put together with the massive help of an organization called Climate Central. You see it in the bottom right corner of the screen there. It's a policy neutral nonprofit news organization, and what they do is analyze and report on climate science. I've been working with their meteorologists since they got started back in 2008. And this evening is a presentation of facts based on the latest scientific consensus. That's what we're going to talk about tonight is facts. So we're going to do that and move forward with them and talk about the fact that climate change, kind of the subtitle this evening, climate change is simple, it's serious, and it's solvable. Simple meaning we understand the problem. Serious meaning it's already impacting us in significant ways, and those impacts are accelerating. And solvable, probably my favorite part, meaning that we have the knowledge and tools to avoid the worst impacts. But let's work on that simple part. And let's talk about simple. It's a reasonable place to start, I think, because I don't know, I'm a simple kind of a guy. I like to start with the basic idea of climate change. And the basic idea is that humans burn fossil fuels. And by that, I mean coal, oil, and natural gas. Now, this burning of fossil fuels puts carbon dioxide into the atmosphere, also called CO2. I'll use the two interchangeably this evening. Those things, CO2 or carbon dioxide, go into the atmosphere, and CO2 is a greenhouse gas. It makes the planet warmer than it would otherwise be. Let's talk a little bit about this atmosphere that surrounds our planet and envelops us. It's 99% two things, nitrogen and oxygen. And although everything else makes up just a small amount of the atmosphere, these four, what's called trace gases, are very important. They are water vapor, they're carbon dioxide, methane, and nitrous oxide. I'm going to focus primarily on the middle two, carbon dioxide and methane, because they're the most important for what we talk about climate change. Now, some of you may have heard the term greenhouse effect. Maybe you heard it back in school, or maybe you remember all the way back in the 70s when this whole phenomenon was referred to as the greenhouse effect. When it was a bit of a misnomer, people said that the greenhouse effect was getting worse and it's causing us problems. Well, we don't use that terminology anymore, but the greenhouse effect is no doubt an important part of what's going on, and it's worth briefly going over. So that's what we're going to do. Sunlight reaches the Earth from the sun 93 million miles away. Now, some of that energy is reflected back into space, but a lot of that energy is absorbed and then re-radiated across the globe and radiated back to the ground as heat. Now, believe me, it's a really good thing that this happens. If we didn't have the greenhouse effect, re-radiating heat in all directions, Earth's surface would be about 60 degrees Fahrenheit colder than it is now. We've had the greenhouse effect for millions of years. It ebbs and flows, but it's critical to life on Earth. If we didn't have it, it would be near 0 degrees Fahrenheit on our planet instead of 60. And believe me, that would be a huge problem. But slight changes in those trace gases make for big differences in the climate around us. And the science understanding this actually goes back quite a long way. Starting all the way back in the 1820s, just a little bit of history lesson here on how we got to where we are on this science. Joseph Fourier in the 1820s, guy from France, proposed that there were gases in the atmosphere that made the Earth warmer than it would be without them. Then in the 1850s in our country, Eunice Foote discovered that carbon dioxide actually warms the air around it, around the carbon dioxide. And I have to take just a moment to give huge kudos to Eunice Foote, a woman in science in the 1850s who managed to make a major breakthrough surrounded by nothing but privileged men. And for more than 100 years, she didn't even get credit for this. But we've corrected the record, and she made a huge contribution, as do so many scientists that are females all over the world right now. And hats off to them. All right, back to the timeline. In the 1880s, so we're talking 140 plus years ago, Savante Arrhenius calculated that a doubling of atmospheric carbon dioxide would raise the Earth's temperature by several degrees. And then in the 1930s, still almost 100 years ago, a guy named Guy Stewart Callendar actually made the first sophisticated calculations and suggested that there was evidence that the Earth would warm. So important is his work that most scientists actually call this the calendar effect rather than the greenhouse effect these days. So that's a little bit about how we got to understand the science. We understand that carbon dioxide plays a critical role regulating the temperature of the planet. So, starting especially in the 1800s and the latter half of that century, humans started burning more and more fossil fuels, first coal, then oil, and then natural gas. Now, these fuels powered the Industrial Revolution. Without a doubt, it raised the standard of living of millions of people around the world, but it also increased the amount of CO2 in the atmosphere. So, if Callendar and the others were correct, we would expect to see temperatures rise as CO2 increases. So, let's look at the data. This is a rough graph of carbon dioxide levels. It's smoothed out a little bit, but it's starting in the 1880s, where you can see for yourself at that time our kind of baseline CO2 levels were around 290 parts per million. Steadily, the rise continued until particularly the second half of the 20th century, when the rise started going up significantly more. We, as of this morning, literally this morning, because I checked the data, we are sitting right now at 428. Now, that's literally off this chart. I leave this chart. We first created this in 2019. I have intentionally left this because now we're up here right about where the eye is. 428 parts per million. Another way to look at it, 50% higher than pre-industrial levels. So what has happened to the temperature? We lay the temperature over the rise of CO2, and you see a very clear correlation. Is it exactly correlated all the time? No, it's not. That's not the way the Earth works. It's not the way science generally works, but the correlation is very clear. And the key point, CO2 is increasing, and it's causing the planet to warm. Now, I want to go back not just 140 years, but let's go back 800,000 years. This is a graph of CO2 levels over that huge period of time. And you can see there's been a lot of fluctuation over that time. We've been in the 100s in carbon dioxide parts per million, and we've been, well, right now, we're higher than we've ever recorded in more than 800,000 years. And some people that are skeptical about the link between man-made or man's activities and climate change sometimes say, well, CO2 has changed over the years a lot, and so have the planet's temperatures. And that's absolutely true. Both those things are true. We can see how carbon dioxide has changed over the last 800,000 years. But there are three very, very important differences on the far right side of this screen. The first is how high we've gone. Not only have we gone higher, much higher than anything we've seen in the last 800,000 years, but Stanford climate scientists estimate that the rate of change, that's big number two, that's the big number two difference, how quickly we're changing. The rate of change is at least 10 times quicker than anything we've seen in the last 65 million years. And we don't have 65 million years of data on CO2, but we know that the rate of change is not like anything we've seen before. The levels where we are, not like anything we've seen before. And the third big difference, this is human caused. And I'll throw in kind of a fourth. There are now 8 billion people on the planet who are affected. There weren't in the years past. These are some major differences from what we've seen before. A couple of slides on methane, because I mentioned carbon dioxide and methane were both important. And I have to tell you, all my years of studying climate change, in the past 10 years, probably the biggest change is the concentration and the better understanding of methane and methane's contribution. You can see here over about roughly the last 40 years how the levels of methane measured globally have been going up significantly. Here's why that's important. Methane, we now estimate, is responsible probably for at least a third of Earth's warming. Now, the good news about methane is it breaks down much faster than CO2 does. It breaks down in 10 to 12 years, whereas carbon dioxide can take hundreds of years to break down in the atmosphere. The bad news is that molecule for molecule, methane is about 80 times more potent as a greenhouse gas than CO2 is. And I remind you that natural gas is about 70 to 90% methane. So when we leak natural gas, we are leaking methane. Scientists are increasingly concentrating on methane as what we like to call low hanging fruit. If we can knock out methane release into the atmosphere in a significant way, in 10 to 12 years, it's gone. We buy ourselves some time, which we very much need. Here is a graph. Now, this is Michigan, but many states are very similar to this, of where our methane sources are. About a third from energy, as I mentioned, natural gas, about a third from agriculture, and a little more than a third from waste. We have solutions for all three of these things to reduce methane. More on that coming up. All right, let's look on the ground and see what these changes I talk about, parts per million of CO2 and methane, what has it meant on the ground where we live? And this is one city, Las Vegas. I know that we have participants from all over the country. This happens to be Las Vegas, Nevada, but many cities look very similar to this. It isn't your imagination. If you can remember back to the 70s, it was indeed cooler then, about 66 and a half degrees on average in Las Vegas, and it has warmed to about 71 degrees in the latest decade that we have complete data for, that is the 2010s. That's what we're actually seeing on the ground. Another way to look at it is, and this happens to be for Detroit, but again, many cities, especially across the northern tier of the United States, have similar patterns to this. Because a lot of times people say, well, what seasons are changing the most in terms of warming? And in most instances, the answer is winter. Winter is the season that has warmed the most. You can see that in the blue. Spring has warmed the least. Summer and fall have both warmed significantly, but not quite as much as winter. And again, this can vary from city to city, but it's a common theme, particularly across the northern third of the country. Now let's broaden out to see what's been happening on the ground as a result of these changes to our atmosphere. And this graph shows us the 10 hottest years globally wide around the world, the 10 hottest years on record. I remember when I started studying this back in the 80s and into the 90s, I would, at the bottom, across the bottom, you would see years like 1936 and you would see 1918 and things like that. Not anymore. The 10 warmest years in recorded global history have been the last 10 years. And I have to throw a little extra at you here. This is through 2023. The data was fairly recently computed. 2024 was hotter than even 2023. So we've knocked 2014 out of the top 10, and the very hottest year globally on record is 2024. It was a little hotter than the previous record, 2023. We have, by the way, reliable records going back to about the mid 1800s. So when we talk about the period of record, that's what we're talking about. So we know that CO2 affects temperature. The future is what we're very, very interested in. And climate scientists use sophisticated computer models to predict how the atmosphere is going to respond to rising CO2. That's how we knew back in the 80s that the warming we're seeing now was going to happen, very, very likely to happen. These earlier versions weren't as sophisticated, but they predicted the warming we have now. They actually under-predicted it a little bit, by the way, as someone who studied them at that time can tell you. But these models are screaming two big important things at us right now. Number one, the amount of warming depends on what happens with future carbon dioxide emissions and methane as well. Lots of CO2 emissions will lead to lots of warming. That would be the red path. On a path toward 8 degrees Fahrenheit of warming globally. And let me just tell you, without going into too many specifics about the physics, you would not recognize that climate at all. Not at all. On the other hand, if we make emissions cuts between now and the latter half of the century, there will still be some warming. Some is baked in the cake, but it will be significantly less. And the idea and the hope is that it is more manageable. So that's the simple part. If you haven't already gotten the idea that it's potentially serious, we'll talk more about that now. The serious part about climate change, and it has many different facets. I've been talking up to this point mostly about averages. They're easy to understand. But the thing to remember is that when the averages shift, as you can see from this graph, we also see a shift in the extremes. On the right-hand side, we see and are seeing more extreme heat and more significant heat. And on the flip side, we're seeing less extreme cold and less significant cold. Not to say we're not seeing extreme cold and cold. Climate change involves shifts in weather patterns and greater likelihood of extremes to happen. The difference is we might see extreme cold, but it doesn't last as long and it isn't as affecting as large an area. The flip side is more heat and more extreme heat, which is lasting a long time and impacting significant areas. Now, part of the reason we use the terminology climate change rather than just global warming is that it makes for a lot of changes to our weather patterns that aren't directly, they might be caused by the warming temperatures, but they aren't directly warming temperatures. I'm talking about billion-dollar weather disasters, and this graph just reflects this country. I know it's a global phenomenon. This is just data for this country. And basically what you're seeing here is going back to 1980. How many times did we have an event that caused at least $1 billion worth of damage? This is just dollars and cents. And by the way, they're adjusted for inflation. So that is not a factor here. What is noticeable is that in the 1980s, we would have very few of those events, less than 5 a year typically. But as you can see very clearly for yourself, as we've gone through time, there are more and more and more of those events. You can see it for yourself. I'll just briefly cover the last 2 years. In 2023, we had a total of 18, excuse me, in 2023, we had 28. We had 28 such disasters. That's showing up right here. What's not on the graph is that in 2024, we had 27, almost the same number that we had the year before. Now, this is just dollars and cents. This doesn't talk about destroyed lives, destroyed livelihoods, cultural patterns that are extremely impacted by this. It doesn't talk about any of that. But what it does remind us is that when there are people who say making the changes we need to make is going to be expensive, I present to you the data that shows us that not doing anything is also very, very expensive. And this is just in this country. Now, the climate change that we're seeing globally makes for regional changes in climate and weather patterns that you may not necessarily associate with climate change. I'm going to give you a brief little example, and this is Northwest Pennsylvania. So imagine for me, if you will, the snow belt of Northwest Pennsylvania. I don't know if we have anybody that's listening to us from there, but in and around Erie, Pennsylvania, they get heavy lake effect snow. They have for as long as we can remember. But here's what's one example of one place where things are changing. The lakes are warmer than they used to be. They're staying warmer than they used to be. They're staying ice-free longer than they used to. What that means is that when cold air flows over Lake Erie, next to Erie, Pennsylvania, it is better able to pick up moisture and dump heavy lake effect snow downwind in and around Erie, Pennsylvania. That makes for heavy lake effect snow, heavier than it used to be. Where you might have used to see 2 inch per hour snowfall, now you can easily get 3 inches an hour in snowfall. And you can see torrential squalls of snow. And people say, global warming, what global warming? Well, ironically, that is exactly what we could expect in the climate changed world. Heavier bursts of lake effect snow. I know it's counterintuitive, and there are literally dozens and dozens of examples similar to this all over the world of how climate change is changing localized climates, sometimes not in ways that you would think it would, but it is. And another way, by the way, is more of the precipitation in the mountain west of this country is falling as rain rather than snow, which makes it harder to store for drinking water later on. Those are just two brief examples to give you a general idea. And of course, one of the iconic pieces of imagery of change, along with polar bears, which I will not show, is the retreat of glaciers. And this happens to be the Bear Glacier up in the Kenai Fjords of Alaska, just over a 7 year time period. I could show you dozens and dozens if we had the time. We don't need to. Glaciers are retreating and they're retreating very quickly, but that's not just a concern for tourism. It's not just kind of a sad thing because glaciers are cool to look at. It also causes two major life-changing events in and around glaciers. The first is what's called glacier lake outburst floods. They happen when glaciers are melting, they form little ice dams. The water backs up behind that ice dam. Eventually, it gives, and there's a burst of a flood, as the name suggests. Typically, these happen in areas with poor communication, so there's little, if any, warning. They happen very, very quickly, and they have resulted in significant loss of life in glacierized areas all over the world and will continue to do so. Impact number one. Number two, millions of people around the world rely on melting glacier ice for their drinking water. And when the glaciers disappear, so too does their drinking water. So retreating glaciers are not just making for poorer pictures. They impact people's lives in very huge ways. Now, up to this point, we've talked just about the land, but almost 3/4 of the ocean of the Earth's surface is the ocean, and it's heating up too. As a matter of fact, we estimate that over 90% of the extra heat that the Earth has absorbed has been absorbed by the oceans. They're kind of like a big sponge. They soak up a lot of that heat. And that's important. It's important in a lot of ways and for a lot of reasons. This map you're looking at, and if you're maybe looking away from your computer screen for a moment, I urge you at least briefly to look at this because what we're seeing here, what you're seeing in these orange shades, these orange and red shades that we have here, those are warming areas of the ocean over the last 120 years. And most of the world has seen warming ocean waters. This area near the very bottom, that's a data void because of the way the maps are. But most of the world has seen at least moderate to significant ocean warming. There's another data void over here on the right. But this area is not a data void. That is actually colder ocean water than what used to be there. And if we had the opportunity, I would love to entertain guesses as to why that might be happening. We don't. Instead, I'll just let you think about it while I take a quick sip, and I will tell you what many of you may have guessed. That cold ocean water is a result of the melting glaciers from Greenland, the big landmass just north of that, or just on this side of that. Greenland is dumping massive amounts of cold, less salty water into the North Atlantic Ocean. Now, why is that important? It's important because the Gulf Stream. We've all heard of it. Those of you living in Virginia, North Carolina, live with it on a regular basis if you're near the coast. The Gulf Stream flows from south to north along the east coast of North America. Then it starts bending eastward up near Greenland and heads toward Western Europe. As the Gulf Stream hits this cold, not as salty water, it's disrupted. And it's disrupted continually as it hits that water. And we know why that's happening. It's been happening for a long time. The reasonable question that people ask is, what is it going to mean? And ladies and gentlemen, the answer is, we don't know. We have theories. We have ideas, but we don't exactly know. There is a lot of uncertainty in the science on this particular point. And by the way, it has a name, the Atlantic Meridional Overturning Circulation, or AMOC. I wouldn't bore you with that. It won't help you at a cocktail party, except over the coming years, you probably will hear more about it. Because there are some projections that show that that disruption could change global weather patterns in a massive way within as short a period of time as 20 years. There are other projections that show it could easily take 70, 80, 90 years. Large disparity in what the projections are telling us about this, telling us about that particular issue. But what I can tell you is we are conducting an experiment on the Earth, and we don't know how it's going to come out. That may be disconcerting, but I promised you at the start that I would tell you the truth. Something else that especially concerns those near the ocean waters is the rise in sea level. Now, this graph shows us each bar is 100 years. And basically, I just put this up here so that you can see over the past 2,000 years, this is 20 centuries shown here. Over the past 2,000 years, global sea level would go up a couple inches, then it'd go down a couple inches, then it'd go up a little, and then it'd stay the same, and then it'd go down 3 inches. And you get the idea. Until last century, the 20th century, it went up almost 6 inches during that century, more than we've seen over a 2,000-year period of time. Really important point here. Sea levels are rising for two reasons, and they're almost equal. Number one, the melting glacial ice that's going into them. That's one. Number two, when you warm water up, it takes up more space. And I already showed you that we've warmed the oceans, so they're taking up more space. It's not just one of those things. Some people think it is. You've watched this presentation, you now know otherwise. Now, as for the future, here's another spot where there's a lot of deviation in what the sophisticated computer models are telling us. Most of them project that between now and 2050, the mid part of the century, 25 years from now, we will rise about another 12 inches from where we are now. Where are we now? We're already almost 6 inches higher than we were last century. So that's going to put us literally up here, kind of off the charts once again, where my little red dot goes away. That's the middle of the projections. Some are higher, some are lower. But for those of you living near the coast or having interest near the coast, you're going to watch that closely, I'm sure, as am I. Now, one of the most important concepts I hope you take away from this evening is, in terms of understanding climate change, it's the relationship between temperature and the amount of water vapor in the air. The bottom line is that a warmer atmosphere holds more water vapor. That's why it's more humid in the summer. That's the warmer atmosphere holding more moisture. The warmer atmosphere is like a sponge that is more effective. An increase in temperature allows more evaporation into the atmosphere from oceans, lakes, soil, plants. So more water vapor is then available for storms. And remember, most of our globe is water. 1 degree increase Fahrenheit leads to 4% more water vapor. Well, we've already seen at least 2 degrees Fahrenheit of increased temperature globally, and in some spots considerably more than that. That is part of the reason we are seeing more heavy downpours, like what unfortunately and tragically has been in our news over the last several days, because warmer air holds more water. And that's a very important concept for us to understand. It effectively supercharges the water cycle. It increases the amount of rain, but here's the part that might not come to your head right away. It also can help to trigger longer droughts, because when you have hot weather, if even though the atmosphere can hold more moisture, if the moisture isn't there, all it does is dry things out more quickly and make the drought worse more quickly. So what it does is it increases the extremes on both ends. The key message: wet areas and wet seasons can get wetter, dry areas can get drier. Increased potential for extremes, which is something we hear a lot when we talk about and understand climate change. Extremes are more likely. Look at how the downpours have changed. This is over about a 60-year period, how they've changed around our country. And all parts of the country, the lower 48 anyway, have seen an increase in heavy downpours. Yes, like the kind that made the news. And by the way, the Texas Hill Country obviously devastated by those storms in and around the Guadalupe River. But 2 days later, parts of North Carolina, west of Durham, At last report, 4 fatalities, rivers that got very close to the highest they've ever been. Was that caused by climate change? No, we don't say it was caused by climate change. Was it impacted by climate change? Yes, the science is very clear on that. It makes that sort of thing, which is happening at this very moment in eastern New Mexico, in Rio Doso, it makes it more likely and it makes it more severe. So, where you might have gotten 10 inches of rain in a short period of time, you could easily get 12 to 13 inches of rain. Might not seem like a lot. It can be the difference between a 2 foot wall of water and a 4 foot wall of water. We're seeing heavier downpours everywhere. And this is just a brief example. I mentioned Raleigh, Durham. I could show you maps, graphs from all over the country, but this is a representative example of central North Carolina. And what it shows is that over the past 50 years, and we've smoothed out the line, when it's raining, it tends to be raining harder than it used to rain. We see that data in almost every significant city around the country. Not in every single one, but in almost all of them, the data bears it out. This is an example of Raleigh Durham. And I have to spend a minute, even though it's early in hurricane season, a couple of moments on hurricanes and climate change and the relationship between the two. Warming oceans, a warmer, wetter atmosphere, that's the fuel for hurricanes. So you would think that hurricanes would get worse. Well, let's get a little more careful with our wording. The current climate science indicates that hurricanes are not likely to be more common. In other words, we don't necessarily go from an average of 12 hurricanes to 15. The number, all the latest models that focus on this are telling us that the numbers are probably going to be similar to what they have been. The difference is that the storms that do form have greater potential to be big and powerful storms with heavier rain and more flooding. Part of the reason for the greater flooding is the higher base level, the higher baseline sea levels that I talked about earlier. So you're starting off with a bigger deal. But unfortunately, over about the last 5 years, we've seen increasing evidence in the models that show us that we're going to see more of this rapid intensification of hurricanes that we have seen with ground truth over the last 5 or 6 years in a number of Gulf Coast hurricanes and East Coast hurricanes. So when they do make landfall, the sea levels make the storm surge worse. And obviously, yet another thing that makes the whole issue worse is that we've had tremendous development. This is an infrastructure issue. We've had tremendous development. So the damage from a hurricane that's exactly the same as one that might have hit 40 years ago is significantly greater. And by the way, the the major way that most people have already seen climate change, whether they realize it or not, is in their homeowners insurance costs. And that's not going to get better anytime soon, just FYI. All right, on the flip side, Western Drought Index. This is a weird graphic, and I apologize for how weird it is, but basically it shows the last 120 years, and wherever you see these lines, this is in the Western United States, wherever you see these lines, the longer they are, the more frequent they are, shows us the more frequent drought that is going on. And we are seeing more drought in the Western United States, drier areas staying drier for longer periods of time. The climate models back in the 80s told us this was going to happen. It is happening. And once again, we put on top of that changes that humans have induced where more and more people are living in areas prone to drought. You compound your problems and you make it more likely for fires to be an issue. This is about a 50-year chart. The red showing changes in number of days affected by fire weather. And you can see in the Western United States, that's been a big change. Hasn't been so much in the East, but it has been in the Western United States in a significant way. And this is a trend that we expect is likely to continue as well for a lot of reasons. Many trees have died because of disease, some of it fueled in part by changing climate, but that adds to the issue as well. But the models have expected more forest fires, and we're seeing them. So that's plenty of serious, but it's serious in one particular area. Let's broaden out briefly before we move forward and talk about other ecosystems and other things on Earth other than humans, because of course we're not the only ones. Climate change is impacting the natural world, of course. Animals and plants have adapted to specific climate conditions and they're changing. And as I showed you before, they're changing very, very quickly. So, where they can, species will move north or poleward. They'll move higher in elevation if they can. If they can. Some are more mobile than others. But seasonal cycles get disrupted. Things bloom earlier in the spring, maybe before something comes to consume it, and you can't always make adjustments to that. A very brief, again, localized example here in Michigan, walleye are a really big fish for a lot of reasons. And the walleye spawn when the ice breaks up in the spring. Well, as you might expect, the ice is breaking up on average earlier or not forming at all in some areas. And on average, a very detailed study showed that on average, the ice is breaking up 4 weeks earlier than it did just 30 years ago. Now, that's pretty rapid change. Now, the walleye are adaptive. They've been adapting for millions of years. And in a short period of time, 20 to 30 years, they have moved up their spawning a full week on average. A full week for a species to do that quickly is pretty amazing. The problem is it's a full week they moved it up, and they would need to move it up 4 weeks. So what's happening is the walleye stock is decreasing. And that again is a microcosmic example of what's happening with many, many different ecosystems and species all throughout places all over the country and indeed the world. Our health is being impacted by climate change in ways you may or may not think about. The worsening air quality, warm air conditions make air pollution worse. Climate change amplifies the wildfires, as I talked about, putting more of those PM 2.5 particulates in the air, which are extremely nasty and do permanent damage when we inhale too many of them. And burning coal and diesel, those are CO2 sources, obviously. But the heat impacts us directly, increasing the days where physical activity is not a good idea or even dangerous. That's especially important for outdoor workers, for athletes, for young people. Mosquito and tick-borne diseases like Zika, malaria, and Lyme are actually spreading into new locations and sticking around longer allergy seasons, even more potent poison ivy. These are all impacts of climate change that we are witnessing around us in this country. And of course, food and farming is impacted. The millions of people that work in this to bring food to our table, well, climate change impacts them with drought and flood, with heat waves, wild weather events. The planting zones have to shift. And in many cases, they can shift, and in many cases, they can't. And again, this is going on around the world. Uh, Famous Colombian coffee, they have to keep moving up the mountains to grow it, and they're going to be running out of mountains. Believe me, the Colombian farmers are extremely concerned about this, as are our local, this country farmers. All right, let's take a breath and talk about Solvable because it is serious, but where we need to talk about Solvable is what needs to be done. And I will tell you right off the bat, it won't be easy, but it's possible. So let's look at the big picture. To stay below our target, and our target is about 3 degrees, excuse me, 1.5 degrees Celsius or 3 degrees Fahrenheit. And I apologize that we bounce back and forth between Celsius and Fahrenheit. Most of the world uses Celsius. We convert for Fahrenheit in some cases, but the global target is to keep our rise in temperature below 1.5 degrees Celsius, which is about 3 degrees Fahrenheit. Now, we're getting really close to that. When we talk about that target, we talk about that on a consistent basis. We exceeded it for 2024 from the baseline, but we don't think that's necessarily going to stay up at that high level. But either way, what this graph is showing us is that most estimates suggest we have to stabilize CO2 levels. If we don't, we're going on this red line path up toward 8 degrees Fahrenheit of warming, which again is an atmosphere and a condition and a climate that we do not want to contemplate. We certainly don't want to experience or hand to our children and grandchildren. On the other hand, if we make the significant cuts quickly, we can drop things down within this century. It is still possible. Now, I know when I'm trying to get my hands around a big problem, I want to start with what the problem is. And in this country, this is where our greenhouse gas emissions come from. 29% from transportation, almost the same amount from electricity. 22% from industry. You see 12% commercial and residential, and 9% is agricultural. The good news on this is we have solutions to reduce emissions from each and every one of these sectors. And we'll briefly touch on those because one, of course, involves renewable or clean energy. I'm going to call it renewable energy. And on the left, you see a map of this country where the sun shines and where the most renewable energy exists. As you might expect, in the southwestern part of the country, that's where it's the highest. But all over the country, there are significant amounts of solar energy potential that come to Earth every day, and all seasons, I might add. On the right, this is wind energy, and the darker the blue on this map, the more wind energy there is. And you can see it's highest along the east slope of the Rockies into the western high plains. But once again, all over the country, there is at least some wind energy potential. And there is potential which is being utilized. I'm going to show you a quick idea of where we actually are because this transition has been underway for a while. This is the latest year available, 2023. The darker the state, the more solar energy they have generated. And I'll let you absorb that for just a moment. How about Texas and California? How about the states that are white, which means there's not a significant amount at all? By the way, solar and wind energy in the past 13 years, solar's gone down, the costs have gone down by about 90%, and wind energy down by about 70%. But again, this is ground truth. This is what happened for generation in 2023 of solar energy. Here's wind. Again, one of the things that's notable to me here is this is the part of the country where the states are gray, which means there's no significant wind generation. And so too, it's notable the dark blue states where there's significant wind generation already underway. I will let you draw your own conclusions from those, and we'll move on. We, of course, need to electrify transport, and electrifying transport helps with some of our greenhouse gas emissions and a rather significant amount, no doubt about it. But electrifying transport is an involved process, as we have seen certainly for ourselves. This is something that doesn't go without fits and starts. And we know how to produce electricity from renewable sources. We know that that's part of the solution too. You can't have an EV and then charge it, or it doesn't make sense to have an EV and then charge it with electricity that's generated from a coal-fired plant. So you need to do both things. We need to convert cars, buses, trains, and other modes of transportation from those fossil fuels to running on clean generated electricity. Electric vehicles are getting better, but as I mentioned, there are fits and starts. There's infrastructure that needs to be created, but that's actually happening on a significant level, and a lot of companies are making significant investments and commitments to that. Now, better buildings are part of the solution too. We obviously use a lot of energy to heat and cool our buildings, and architecture and building design can increase energy efficiency a lot and requiring less energy for daily operations. Simple things like improving insulation can save money and a lot of energy. And for those of you who haven't heard of electric heat pumps, they are an efficient replacement for natural gas or oil heating systems. They're working huge amounts of other countries around the world. They're starting to catch on here. They are a more expensive initial investment, but they work in all climates, and they are a marvelous solution as we move forward. That is electric heat pumps. If you haven't heard of them, you will as time moves on. And back to agriculture, we can reduce emissions through our changing farming practices and actually create better crops in the process. Now, better agriculture practices can lower those methane emissions I talked about. The low-hanging fruit, that potent greenhouse gas is generated in large amounts from rice farming and from raising sheep and cows. Reducing tilling or planting cover crops can also keep carbon, water, and important nutrients in the soil. Even composting food waste reduces the methane emissions from landfills and recycles the fertilizer back to crops. One brief example of a really innovative thing going on in another part of the world, farmers in Australia have produced a fungus that they mix in with the soil that takes up carbon. They mix this special powder in, and it contains these fungal spores when they plant their crops, and the fungus helps store more of the carbon, and the plants absorb more of the carbon for a longer period of time. These are the kinds of technological innovations which are going to help. And as I will say again in a moment, there is no silver bullet solution. Perhaps there are shotgun solutions, lots of little pellets of solutions, and each of these technological innovations can be part of that. So too can making sure that we maintain our natural carbon sinks. I'm talking about wetlands and peatlands and grasslands. These plants take CO2 out of the atmosphere and convert it into plant tissue. And if we can maintain, better yet, restore, but at least maintain those that still exist, prevent them from being developed, it prevents carbon from entering the atmosphere, helping to absorb floodwaters as well, which is a significant issue as we saw earlier. Now, some people say, well, all we really need to do is plant trees. Again, I come back to there is no silver bullet. Trees are wonderful. They are not a silver bullet, but they can help. This is San Francisco, another city in our wonderful country, the city by the bay. And just an example in this particular city, some cities have more trees than San Francisco, some have less. But in the city by the bay, 90 million gallons of storm runoff are avoided by the trees that are there already, and 200,000 pounds of air pollution are absorbed. 10,000 tons of CO2 carbon pollution is removed by the trees that are there. In Metro Detroit, we've made a commitment to planting 75,000 trees in 5 years, and every little bit helps. So, as we get ready to conclude the slides, I have to slow down a moment and recognize that this is going to be very hard. Partly because we have squandered a lot of time, partly because this is a challenge that we as a human race have not faced anything quite like this before. We've had smaller scale things, but nothing of quite this size. But we have done big things before, and this slide represents three of them. How about on the left, indoor plumbing and electricity? People said that couldn't be done, but when it was done and when it was brought to cities, it improved the daily life, made cities safer. Within 2 generations, there was a doubling of the average life expectancy when that kind of safety and sanitation became common in areas where people gathered. It was a big thing. We managed to do it. How about the space program represented by that center slide? The space age, when JFK stood in the early 60s and said, we choose to go to the moon not because it's easy, but because it's hard. And he projected that we would have a human being on the moon and bring it back safely by the end of the decade, and they laughed at him. No way. Well, we know how that turned out. And one of the things that we couldn't have expected is the amount of data that we now have because of satellites that help us understand the world around us and so many other things to learn and know more about the environment because of the space age that people doubted could ever happen. And on the far right, in the information technology revolution. 18 years ago, there wasn't even an iPhone. That's not a very long time. How has IT changed the world around us for hundreds of millions of people, transformed our world in just a couple of short decades with instant communication over vast areas? It's hard to even grab around the idea of how much this has changed, and people said it couldn't happen, but it did. We rose to a challenge. Two last graphs I have to show you. This is what happens, and I will explain what these bars are. This is by generation, and this is what each generation will deal with over their time on our planet if we don't reduce our carbon pollution. So across the bottom, the greatest generation, we don't have too many of them left. You see the baby boomers. The solid area is what's already happened. And on the left, this is amount of warming that has happened. The hatched area is what is projected to happen. So the baby boomers are projected to deal with up to 4 degrees Fahrenheit of change. And then you can see by generation, Gen X, Millennials, Gen Z. Gen Alpha, let me just tell you, I didn't know what they were. These are newborns to preteens. Okay, these are the little ones, little ones. And this is what, if we don't make the changes we're talking about, remember what I said about 8 degrees Fahrenheit? Not even recognizable climate, not even a recognizable planet. That's what we hand them if we don't make the changes we know we need to make. On the other hand, if we do, if we make the cuts in carbon and methane that we're talking about, yes, there will still be problems. There will still be rise. You see, the hatched areas don't go away, but it is a vastly different world if we do compared to if we don't. And I don't know about you, but I think a lot these days about what's going to be happening when I'm not here anymore. And I don't know about why you chose to devote some of your precious evening time to this, but I know why I did and why I work to combat climate change whenever and however I can by talking to whomever I can. And that would be this one is our daughter, this one is our son's girlfriend. I think about them and their as yet unborn children, and it motivates me to continue, even though at times it can seem bleak. But the science is simple because we've understood it since the 1800s. Obviously, this is serious. You know that before you even watched this evening. Maybe you know a little more now, but the solvable part. We know what we need to do. Solutions already exist. Others are coming down the line. It will make life significantly better. And as I get ready to wrap, special thanks to Scott Denning at Colorado State University for helping to put together these slides and the whole simple series, Solvable Framing. Scott's a great guy, and I really appreciate the opportunity to work with him. And I will leave you with this slide, and I want you to know it's in the resource page, as is the address for Climate Central in the resource page. But people will almost always ask me, what is something that I can do? So I'm putting this up for a brief time here. Screenshot it right now if you'd like to. Again, it will be in actually expanded form in the resource page that goes into a little bit more detail. But we love lists of 10. So I've composed a list of 10 things that you can do. And I ask, please, in the next week, try to do at least 2 of these things. And at the very bottom, also, you can see a place where I can be reached, weatherchris.com. And also, if you're interested in solution videos that are easy to understand and tremendously well produced, drawdown.org is a great resource for that. So, with that, I see that my time has almost come to an end. I'll leave this up for a couple more seconds and then I will let the ever patient Tina uh, pick up the presentation where I left off. So, I'll leave this up for just a couple more seconds. Remember, we are going to be here in the after party for questions. There'll be opportunity for questions. I or Tina will answer everything we can. And you can always reach out to me in other ways, and I can do whatever answering I can do at a later time. So there you go. Um, I hope you can take it from there, Tina.
I sure can, Chris. Thank you so much. As usual, excellent presentation. There's a lot of feedback in the chat, so I would recommend that you go take a quick look at that, Chris, if you get a moment. So thank you all so much for joining us tonight, and thank you to Red Wine and Blue for inviting Chris and I to join us. Chris and I have partnered on his presentation a few different times now, and it's always a great honor for me to listen in on his presentation and to hear so many interesting facts that reminds me why I do this work. So my name is Tina, and I'm the Michigan organizer for EDF Action. So we are the advocacy partner of the Environmental Defense Fund. And it's wonderful to see so many of you on this call. You're here to learn and share your knowledge on climate topics. We need all of you in this fight. So thank you for being here and keeping the chat so active. I've really enjoyed viewing all your comments. There's so many good points in there. So thank you all for keeping this discussion alive while we're going through the presentation. So let me tell you a little bit about EDF Action. We work to build support around good climate legislation. We empower people to take action on the climate crisis, and we work with our legislators to educate them on the climate impacts that are threatening our world's most vulnerable systems. Today, our work looks very different than it did in years past because the climate efforts are being attacked. Cuts to clean energy, pollution reduction standards, and government services designed to protect us from climate impacts are all being rolled back, and it's just the beginning. So you might have remembered a little while back that the US once again withdrew from the Paris Climate Agreement after we rejoined it with the last administration. We've dismantled over 100 environmental regulations just in this year alone, including limits on power plant emissions, vehicle fuel standards, methane leak rules, et cetera, et cetera. I mean, the list goes on and on. So these moves have delayed the transition to cleaner energy and have allowed more greenhouse gases into the atmosphere in a time when we can least afford it. A lot of climate scientists out there have repeatedly said that the 2020s is our make or break decade. So delaying on this action, like what's happening right now, means that we are out of time, and we must act even more urgently and treat the impacts of climate change as a real crisis, because it is. With some of the new, things coming out of this current administration, new oil pipelines, refineries, there's a false energy emergency. It's basically, these projects have lifespans for decades, and it locks in future emissions. So now, to meet climate goals, we face the added challenge of retiring this infrastructure early, but this administration is keeping coal-fired plants open, even against the will of its owners. That's happening right here in Michigan, where we're located, where they're trying to keep coal plants that were ready to be retired in 2025. They're trying to keep them open. And it just goes on, and it can get very depressing. This new administration isn't just putting a pause on climate progress, it's actively reversing it. And because of that, we're farther behind in our targets, and that means that our work is more important than ever. We've lost precious time, and the challenge ahead is even steeper. Urgent action is now about catching up, limiting damage, safeguarding the future, especially for our younger generations, like Chris just mentioned. I'm also a mom. I have 2 kids that are Gen Alpha, and I really do, a lot of what motivates me in doing this work is for them. I'm worried about what their future is going to look like. So that's what motivates me pretty much every day in this work, but also for all the reasons that all of you mentioned in the chat. Like, people were bringing up such great points on so many different topics. So I was really happy to see that. So what should we do? First and foremost, what my recommendation to folks is to get to know your local legislators. Show up to their town halls, call or email their offices. When you see something, say something. If something in the climate related realm or any other realm is concerning you, you should reach out to the political landscape. Anybody who's within your district, your congresspeople, your senators, state senators, even right down to local mayors and local legislators. It's really important that you make your voice heard, especially in this moment. And second is to pay attention to the regulatory agencies that oversee our weather, such as NOAA, those that are setting standards for clean air and water, namely the EPA, natural resources like the DNR and local and county governments. Utilizing and supporting nonprofits in this moment is extremely important, like Red, Wine, and Blue, like EDF and EDF Action, Sierra Club, LCV. These are great choices. Get to know which of these organizations are doing the work in your state and in your community that they need you now more than ever. And I promise you, you need them more than you think. So yes, please support your local nonprofits that are doing the work that will support what's important to you. So a few actions that I want to share. EDF is right now, we're working hard to push back on the MATS and the carbon pollution standard rollbacks with the EPA. Actually, they had public comments today at the EPA, and a lot of our members were there making public comment on mercury and air toxic standards. We're focused on protecting the communities from dangerous pollutants like mercury, arsenic, all the stuff that gets spewed out of coal-fired power plants. That ends up in our air, our water, soil, food, everything. And the carbon pollution standards protect our communities and the planet from the harms of climate change. The EPA is trying to roll back these standards, which will cause exponential increases in those dangerous pollutants. So in the follow-up information that Red, Wine, and Blue is going to send, there is a comment submission form. So it's digital, and it will automatically submit public comment on your behalf to the EPA while these public comment sessions are open. So I would urge you to do that within the next couple days. Once you get the email and you get the information, really important that we get as many people pushing back on these rollbacks, because these are going to impact some of our most vulnerable communities. And, I'll just throw it out there. If you like this discussion, I loved all the activity in the chat. EDF Action, we have a volunteer meeting every 2 weeks. The next one is on July 15th. We meet every other Tuesday at 5:30 p.m. All are welcome to join. So I can put that link in the chat, and I'm sure that Julie can share that out with you guys afterwards as well. But I want to thank you again for taking the time to be with us tonight. And we hope you will all go away with a sense of empowerment and how you can make your voice heard. Talk about these issues. Talk about the person next to you in the grocery line. Talk to your neighbors. Talk to your friends. Let them know that this is a crisis and that we need to act swiftly on it. So again, thank you all so much for being here. I'm really just so proud to see so much engagement on this topic. So thank you again.
Okay, so we have reached the end of the hour, which is normally how long our events are. But because this was a very obviously in-depth presentation, which everyone is giving tons of love in the chat for, we did want to have what we sometimes call as our after party, or we stay on a little bit longer. So if you have to drop, that is fine. If you would like to hear some of the questions that were asked in the chat, we are going to bring Chris back up, and I'm going to bring up my colleague Julie. You guys, if you come to a lot of events, we're the Julies. We're here all the time. And Julie is she's been pulling your questions, and we're going to do those for about the next 15 or so minutes. And then we will be officially over, but I'm going to let them get started.
So, Chris, you had mentioned that 400 was projected to be, or someone mentioned that 400 was projected to be our end, like that was going to end us. And now the 428 number, what is this? What does this truly mean for us? What is the part that is really just going to take us clean over the edge?
Well, it's an understandable question, but it is not an easy question to answer. There is no falling off a cliff number, and that applies to parts per million of CO2. It applies to average global temperature, which has already risen close to 3 degrees Fahrenheit. There really isn't. I use this metaphor, Julie, to perhaps work better. We are screaming down a very, very dangerous highway at 90 miles an hour with hazards all over the place. We need to slow down, and we need to exit. The sooner that we do one or both of those things, the better. Think of yourself screaming down at 90 miles an hour down a highway. You want to get off as quickly as you can. It's better to get off now. If you get off in a mile, that's better than getting off in 3 miles or waiting 5 miles. And it's better to go 70 than 90. I think that is a better kind of metaphor for us to use rather than thinking that there is any particular number, again, whether it's CO2 or methane concentration or average global temperature, that is going to be the end of us. The truth of the matter is, what we've already seen, as we're seeing, is causing significant problems, and those problems will grow. So, and again, to be perfectly blunt, and I'm going to be blunt with the people who are here right now, we are going to see degradation, we're going to see loss of species, and we're going to see loss of life on a rather significant scale because of what's already happened. That's the truth. Now, how much? That's what we have control over. That's why doing what we do now really matters.
You also had mentioned that the projections from, I guess, 20 years ago or so were actually off. what was the distance and how off were they?
Yeah, another great question. I mean, I distinctly remember in the 80s when the computer models weren't nearly as sophisticated as they are now, but they were saying a lot of these things were happening. And what I kept hearing was, well, yeah, but they could be wrong. It might not be that bad. Well, as it turns out, they were very close, but they were a little off. Here are the two big things that they missed. They missed how quickly the heavy flooding precipitation events would happen. And obviously, again, we're seeing that in the news, and it happens around the world on increasing frequency as well. So the models from the 80s and 90s did not project that to happen that severely this quickly. The other thing they didn't do was they didn't understand how global weather patterns were going to change and lock certain weather patterns in. Now that's a little bit of that kind of gets into a little bit of arcane weather talk, but when a heat wave settles into an area, usually it moves on. The climate change environment has led to more persistence of both heat and cold, wet and dry over certain areas. They just get stuck over certain areas more than what we thought they were going to do when we looked at the projections from the 80s and 90s. Now, those might not seem like big differences. As far as the temperatures, they were pretty good. They were surprisingly good at where we would be in terms of temperatures. A little low in some areas, but overall, not all that bad on terms of temperatures.
Someone asked what you thought of David. I don't know, it was the Suzuki's recent comments.
No David Suzuki, but I would hope that they would share those comments with me before I comment on them because I don't know what David Suzuki has said recently.
Okay. Someone asked if feeding cows seaweed would cut their methane production, cut that.
Okay, great question. I know that there's a lot of experimentation about changing the diets of cows to reduce their methane emission. I don't, off the top of my head, have the expertise to know if seaweed is being used in that experimental way or if it's effective. What I do know is that many different things are being tried, and talk about this sort of thing to try to reduce the gas emissions of cows often produces some snickers, but it makes a real difference, and that research is real, ongoing, and important. And it's going on all over the world. And I might throw in one of the things I had on the 10 things you can do. Here's a way to reduce the emissions of cows, a really effective way. Have fewer cows. And if we have fewer cows, we have fewer cows if less people are eating meat. So when I put up that one of the things you can do to help climate change is to stop eating or reduce your consumption of meat, that is a very effective way to do that because if there's less demand, there will be less cows and there'll be less cow farting, and that's the truth.
Is there a list of resources for the environmental impacts on health? Someone asked.
I actually posted something in the chat. That's a CDC report. I can repost that or I can send it over to you and if you want to share that out.
Yeah, send it to Julie and she'll put it in the email. How do we dispel climate change, misinformation, and disinformation? What are some things that we can say? Or
That's a great question. How many hours do we have? How do we dispel that? I think the simple answer is that you, as an informed individual, need to take the time to discern, and I do this all the time. I know it isn't easy, to discern if someone might listen to reason or if perhaps they won't. You shouldn't waste your time on somebody who is absolutely not going to listen to reason and facts. And that's just the truth of the matter. There are some people that just cannot be convinced. If you sense, however, whether through social media or a person-to-person interaction, that somebody might at least be open to listening to things, then by all means, start with the things you've noticed. You don't have to start with a bunch of graphs that bore people like mine do. Just start with what you've noticed. Gee, have you noticed that there's more of these heavy rains? Have you noticed how much warmer it is than it used to be? Have you noticed how much snow we get from lake effect? Whatever you've noticed, because they probably noticed it too. The best way to have a helpful conversation with somebody is to find common ground. And everybody notices changes if their eyes are open at all. And start with that. Start with the things that matter to you, and they might very well matter to them. And then just start a conversation. In my opinion, the most important thing you can do to help with climate change is to talk to people about it, because a lot of research shows that people are concerned, but they don't talk to each other about it. And there are a lot of reasons for that. I think we know what some of them are, but start with where you are, what you've noticed, see what they've noticed, listen to them. If you discern that they're too far gone, some people will be left at the train station and we're going to move on. But some people will come along with us, and that's your decision to figure out what camp they're in, whether you're in person with them or on social media.
And and I'll add this, the easiest way to start a conversation with someone is to talk about the weather, right? And so we're seeing a lot of extreme weather events, and that's a really easy way to sort of breach that conversation about climate change. So yeah, definitely start with the weather.
Thank you, Tina.
Well, Tina, you started with sharing about talking to local politicians and such, and because folks were asking, what do we say? How do we get that started? But how do we convince, like some of the folks at the higher levels, how do we convince them that this is really an issue, or is it even not worth trying?
Well, there's a lot that is happening right now with the weather, with our extreme weather that we're seeing across the country. That's a great place to start. And what a lot of people don't realize is, these offices, we have to remember that they work for us. We don't work for them, right? So if you have an elected official who you feel, because we work with a lot of electeds across Michigan. And, one of the things that they've asked us over and over again is, please keep us informed of what's going on in your community. Let us know what's happening. What are you most concerned with? These are the things that help form their decisions when they're going in to make votes or to speak publicly on a certain topic. And all you have to do is call or send an email to their office. I mean, it's as easy as that. I mean, I talk to people all the time these days that are literally sending in messages into their elected officials' offices, from the governor's office down to the Congress, senators, everybody. Anybody and everybody who will listen. They're sending these messages in like nonstop because they're so concerned with all the things that are happening. So always remember that is your civic duty, is to keep these legislators accountable. If they've had a vote that you didn't agree with, or if there's a vote coming up that you want them to vote in a certain way, that's the time to pick up the phone or send an email for sure. But yeah, keeping that up, and then also showing up to town halls is really important. That's where they want to hear people submit their questions and voice their concerns.
So there's been a lot of question in the chat about what we can do in our homes. Is wind safe to be by our homes? That was one question. Another question is, what's better, electricity or gas? That was another question. Nuclear energy came into the conversation. So when you're thinking of all of these ways that we can have power, I guess, and have our homes running, what's our best solution? Because everything isn't going to be cost effective either. So what's our best solution?
A lot to unpack there, but first of all, in general, electric or gas, electric. In general, electric makes more sense. There are exceptions. It partly depends on what the grid is. In other words, where the energy comes from in your local area. Just very briefly, here in Michigan, we get 33% of our electricity from coal, 30% from nuclear, 27 natural gas, and 10% is renewable. We've made commitments in Michigan, and Tina is working hard on the politicians talking about this and trying to make it happen to increase that renewable significantly in the years to come. 10% renewable is not very much, and many states are much higher than that, but that's the mix here in Michigan. Now, if you have a high mix of electricity generated by coal, that doesn't really help you all that much to have electricity powering things in your home because that electricity is generated by dirty coal. So it's not a completely easy answer to give, but in general, certainly, let me put it this way. If I'm getting a home and I have a choice between a natural gas stove or an electric stove, definitely an electric stove. Wouldn't be any doubt in my mind. I'm going to get an electric stove. And that would be the case regardless of what my mix was in my area. Now, pivoting briefly to nuclear. Nuclear, in my opinion, and there is a division of opinion in this sort of thing, but nuclear can potentially buy us some time. Nuclear energy does not produce greenhouse gas emissions. We desperately need time. If we can bring some, like we have a nuclear power plant here in Michigan, we're trying to bring back online, which was shut down. Maybe it'll work, maybe it won't, but it's worth trying because nuclear energy does buy us time. It obviously has its flaws regarding its waste, and we're all familiar with that sort of thing, but it's better than some of the alternatives, even though some people do feel differently about that. And finally, the first question you had, wind near your home, I would have no problem with a wind generating farm, if you will, near my own home. I would have none at all. And I'm just going to throw this in. The mortality of birds is not supported by science at all. More birds are killed by cats than by wind farms by far, not even close. That's just misinformation and distracting crap.
Got it. Got it. Okay.
Yep, be on the
Um,
lookout for that misinformation because I know, especially with renewable energy sources, the fossil fuel industry got way ahead of that years ago, like decades ago, going in and telling people that it creates vibrations in the ground, that it puts radiation out, that solar panels put radiation into the ground. All of these are false. And it's the misinformation and disinformation that the fossil fuel industry has been deliberately sending out into the world.
So how do we take positive steps when our elected leaders are eliminating some of the things that we would be able to do?
Meaning, like, are you talking about renewable energy or?
Well, I think EV was brought up specifically in that particular question.
Okay, yes. So EVs. Yes. So we have talked a lot on this topic. We talk a lot about clean energy sources, EVs, things like that. How are we going to preserve those? Yes, the incentives are going to be removed by the end of 2025. We kind of knew that was going to happen. But I will tell you this. The market demand for clean energy and electric vehicles and things like that, it is not going away. The market will drive the growth. And I've spoken to several people in these industries in recent months, and especially for electric vehicles. The electric vehicle industry is very confident that the market will continue to drive the demand. And as that continues to grow, where my concern lies a little bit more is with the infrastructure. So the infrastructure, which is what allows us to charge these cars, having chargers out on the road and on freeways and making them accessible to the drivers, is really, really important. And that has actually grown slower than the demand for electric vehicles. So that is really where my concern is. And so that's where I focus my conversations when I'm talking to legislators and we're talking about policy. we need to find more ways to continue to build this infrastructure. And I know that there's a lot of private companies that are going to continue putting in EV chargers and things like that, but we need to continue that demand. That's the only way that it's going to keep up. So just remember that your pocketbook, what you buy and what your driving habits are and what you're, bringing into your home are going to drive a lot more than what the government will dictate through mandates and executive orders and what they're rolling back. So you have a lot of power in creating that. So that's what we're focusing in on right now, because we knew that the incentives were going to go away. So now it's up to corporations and nonprofits and other groups to sort of continue that momentum.
One of the questions that I think I saw you answering, Chris, but was about jet engines and why are they left out of the talk? Why are folks not talking about how they pollute?
Okay, it's a great question, and it is a significant issue, and it's one that is being worked on. Sustainable aviation fuel, that is fuel that does not produce greenhouse gas emissions, is available. It's extremely expensive right now, so it's not scalable. It's not a market solution yet, but there's intensive work being done on it. In terms of being left out, it's not left out. When I showed you that 29% of greenhouse gas emissions in this country come from transportation, that includes jet engine exhaust, which globally accounts for about 3.5% of global greenhouse gas emissions, jet engine fuel. And that number is rising because the amount of jet travel continues to rise. It's pretty much doubled over the last 20 years. It's very, very significant. On the 10 things that you can do, I talk about a way to offset those, to purchase some credits, which not saying what needs to be done, but that's something that you could do if you chose to do. Carbonlighthouse.org allows you to offset emissions that you might be responsible for if you utilize jet travel.
Okay, so it looks like that maybe one last one here. How is the impact of 2025 IPCC report, the International Planet Climate Council, which reports to the UN, viewed by US scientists?
How is it viewed by scientists? Is that what the question was?
Mm-hmm. Yes.
Well, first of all, US-based scientists are some of the significant contributors to the IPCC report. Whenever it comes out, we have been for many, many years. Unfortunately, as Tina was alluding to, some of that funding has been cut at this point, and our future participation level is in jeopardy, quite frankly. But in a nutshell, the IPCC report, which is put out by a division of the United Nations, is widely accepted by 192 countries around the world as a nonpartisan scientific document with a plan of what we need to do. Our scientists help create it. Our scientists, generally speaking, accept it, and that won't change in 2025 or 2026. We just might have less to do with creating it, and we might fall farther behind in our targets, which the IPCC report lays out. It lays out targets for all countries. We might fall farther behind in those targets, but we still see it as a hugely important and credible piece of essentially a target for how we get out of this mess. That's what the IPCC report tells us.
I just want to thank you both for being here. I could see you all coming back and maybe focusing on, because someone asked about the ranking of meat, meaning beef and pork and chicken, and what, if folks are going to eat that kind of protein, what's the best and least harmful. I could see
stay local. That's all I can say. Just stay local. Go to your local farmer's market. Don't go to Kroger when you can.
So that's just like one of the things in here. It looks like there's a myriad of topics that we could have you back and talk about.
I would, first of all, thank you so much for inviting us. I'm honored and very pleased to be here. What a wonderful audience. What tremendous questions. I wish we could answer them all. I would love the idea. This is such a big topic, as you see,
Mhm.
um, of breaking off a part of it. For instance, we could just do a presentation that what can individuals do? We
Mhm.
could easily fill an hour with just what individuals can do. I did the whole broad thing about what climate change is all about. Now that we've got that behind us, how about focusing on the solvable part of the presentation that I gave, which Tina would be wonderful to help with as well. But again, I want to say thank you. I was very, very pleased to be here, and I love the enthusiasm, and I hope we can do something in the future. I really do, because time is not on our side. I always say I want to talk to as many people as quickly as possible without delay because we have squandered too much time. There is still reason for hope, but the window is getting smaller. So
And to
thank you
see
all.
the size of this audience tonight was so just gave me another boost of optimism that people are actually paying attention and they're here to learn and they want to share. And that is exactly how we're going to get to where we need to go. So thank you all so much for all your contributions tonight for this presentation.
Yeah, I thinking by the end there was probably over 600 people because people join, people leave, and people come back. So thank you, Julie, for already appreciating our guests. We definitely would love to have you back. This is an important topic, and I know it's something our members care about. I'm dropping in the chat one more time. This is the resource page that, oh, it's already disappearing in the chat. Hold on a second. You guys are very busy in the chat. I'm going to stop it for 1 second. This is our resource page from our national events. Everything that Tina and Chris have given me so far is there. If they want to send me additional things like the health document or links to anything else, I will add to that page. So go back and check it. You also probably have an email already in your inbox from me. If you don't see it, check spam, and that also has this link. But thank you both so much. And thank you to all the amazing questions. And thanks for hanging out for this after party for almost like 260 of you. So
Exactly. Well, thank you so much for having us. Red, Wine, and Blue is such an impressive organization, and what an honor to be here tonight. So thank you for having us.
thank you both. And Julie, of course, thank you for the amazing capturing all those questions. So, all right, we will see you all soon. Have a good night.